A little bit about why we're here, and I'll introduce the panel. The panel is called Legacies and Opportunities. I mean, I've been on the planning committee, and I realized only retrospectively that because the focus was on the anti-war movement, in a sense we replicated part of the problem of the anti-war movement, which is to pay relatively little attention to the three countries that were the focus of, or the motivation of our work. And, you know, I'm glad everyone is here, but in a sense, I wish that the whole conference were here because other than Pat Schroeder's wonderful injection and then Tom's response to mine in the plenary, you couldn't tell that there were these countries and these peoples that are still there today. So that's what we're trying to do. We're talking about legacies in the sense of the impacts of the war that live on today. Because as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the three peoples in the three countries and American veterans who served in the three countries, Vietnam is, or the war is not the past, it's the present in terms of their lives. So we're gonna start out talking about legacies. Rick Weidman is with Vietnam Veterans of America, which is the membership organization of Vietnam veterans, and it's played a crucial role at the grassroots level of involving veterans, motivated probably initially by their own issues, but often going beyond that. And Rick, I'll leave you the rest of it to you to talk about in your presentation.
A number of people mentioned that with John they organized something having to do with Vietnam. Is there anybody here who wasn't organized by John? At one point or another?
Yes, most of them.
My name is Rick Weidman, and I grew up in New York City. I served as a medic in Vietnam in 1969. Prior to that time, I attended Colgate University, and by my junior year, I came from a very traditional family, and by my junior year, I reading enough to know this ain't working. I mean, this war should not be happening, and it's a terrible waste of American lives and Vietnamese lives. But I do believe in service, and I also believe that the people who reap the choicest fruits of the society need to shoulder the heaviest burden. And by late '68, many of my friends who I ran track with in public high school in New York City had already been killed. Yes. So I gave up an ironclad deferment. And I got that deferment when I worked for the National Students Association. Ed Schwartz, who was then the president, said, "What are you going to do about the draft?" And I said, "I guess I'll write him a letter." So I wrote General Hershey a letter explaining why the war was bad and stupid and not in the national interest, and what I was doing seeking to end the war, which was in the national interest, and therefore you ought to give me an occupational deferment. They decided that I was too much trouble and gave me the deferment. I subsequently left and worked for Al Lowenstein for almost a year, and realized after the '68 election we were not going to end this war through American politics. And at that point, it was no longer honest to have the deferment. So gave it up, and I thought it'd take a couple of months, and I think it probably took about 1.2 seconds for my draft board on the Upper West Side to reclassify me 1A. And I ended up being a medic. I don't regret that. Proud to serve, and I'm particularly proud of what I did. I did serve without a weapon. And some people, when I say that, say you weren't unarmed. You had your mouth So, veterans after Vietnam, and when I came home, I was teaching at Johnson State College, which is one of the Vermont State College's 4-year colleges in Vermont. And veterans started coming to me with tremendous problems. Being a medic, I was fine. It was the other guys I was worried about. Or at least that's what I firmly believed. We organized in Vermont only, a community-based Vietnam Veterans Association, and started dealing with employment and barriers to employment. And the biggest barrier to employment was, in fact, PTSD. We didn't have a name for it then, but it was PTSD. And some guys we knew we couldn't send out to employers because they'd never talked to us. The employers had never talked to us again. Through Al Lowenstein, I met David Bonnier, through David Bonnier met Bobby, actually re-met Bobby, and it turns out we met after I came home from Vietnam in 1970. And Bobby was trying to get this organization going. It was many steps, but basically Bobby encouraged me and suckered me into working full-time for a year, which I did, and we got Vietnam Veterans of America started, which is, with no money, was a difficult proposition. Most people at that point of Vietnam vets still didn't put it on their resumes because you wouldn't get a job, and if you had a job, you wouldn't get promoted. It's as simple as that. And came across a study in the 80s by a guy by the name of James Bordieri, who now runs a center on employment at University of Illinois. And he and some other folks did resumes and worked with HR people at Fortune 500. And the only difference in it, these resumes were, on some it was clear they did not serve in the military at all. Some it was clear they served in the military but did not serve in Vietnam. And some it was clear they served in Vietnam. 71% of the time, they took the, and then they had non-vets for the same things. They took the non-vet over any vet. 91% of the time, they took a non-vet over an in-country vet. And when they were asked why, they said, because we don't want any problems. And so the image that had been pounded out by Kojak shows and every other darn thing, and the early movies, were just horrible. I mean, they didn't have anything to do with our experience. The only thing they got right in Apocalypse Now was when they went into the hot LZ in the village, and in the confusion of a firefight, they got right. Because you spend most of the time trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And the fact that Coppola had no idea what he was doing only contributed to the veracity of what was happening on the screen. And that's why we founded Vietnam Veterans of America. And our founding principle, though, is never again shall one generation of American veterans abandon another. And make no mistake about it, we were abandoned by my father's generation. And our view is we did a pretty good job with the only war my father's generation gave us. And we were the first ones to go back to Vietnam. And so, of course, we were put into the VFW, American Legion, were communists. And that was in 1981. We sent a delegation of 4 people, 4 vets, back to Hanoi, and that began a dialogue. Our motivation at that time was twofold. POW MIA in the fullest possible accounting, and Agent Orange. And we still have contact with the Vietnamese, and the same 2 things are always on the agenda. I could go into more depth, but on the Agent Orange stuff and the missteps Had Charles not been there, I don't think anything would have happened for Vietnam, because just after we got an intergovernmental agreement signed in 2002 at the first ever International Conference on Agent Orange, the Bush administration set out to destroy it. And was supposed to, under that agreement, have an epidemiological study and a environmental study of what resides in the landscape. Since that time, we have testified whenever we've had the opportunity for assistance to Vietnam. Mr. Falangea, when he was head of that subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, asked, what is your motivation as Vietnam vets? And Mr. Falangea is a vet, served in the same division I did, the American Division. And his brother died of Agent Orange-related cancer. I said, very simple. I was a Boy Scout. First thing was hammered in my head from 8 years on is you leave the campsite better than you found it. And we did not. Not only with Agent Orange, but all the other damage, horrific damage that we did to that country in every which way, including the people who were quote-unquote on our side. So that's the involvement of VVA. We still send delegations back at least one a year to Vietnam. It's always focused on those two things. We go in, and first visit in is to tell the embassy what we're going to do, and last thing going out is tell the embassy what happened. And we work closely with the Veterans Association of Vietnam. For veterans in the United States, many Vietnam vets never did get on crack. And it just didn't happen. Last year, I was testifying before the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and the chairman said, Mr. Whiteman, did we learn the lessons of Vietnam? Did we learn any lessons? I thought about it a second and said, no. I'm not known for being taciturn. So he said, no what? I said, no, sir. He said, Rick, you want to elaborate a little bit more? I said, look, we knew how to deal with PTSD. We knew what these kids were going to go through. And 10 days before this invasion of Iraq, Steve Robinson, who unfortunately is now dead from Gulf War exposures, and I got in to see the Assistant Secretary of DOD for Medical Affairs. And we said, look, you've got to set up a non-punitive way where people can come to find help. And so he started to lecture Steve and I, and Steve had been wounded in countries theoretically we would never in. And I was a medic in Vietnam, and I realized he was lecturing us about what it's like to be in a combat unit. I said, wait. With all due respect, sir, it's my understanding, both of our understanding actually, that you never had the privilege of serving your country in uniform. Is that right? He said, yes. I said, then don't sit there and presume to lecture us. Because these kids are going to have neuropsychiatric wounds, and we're damned if we're going to let you throw away another generation. And unfortunately, we weren't able to do as good a job as we wanted, but we were fighting all the way. So they are getting more help, and their issue will not be Agent Orange, but it'll be other things. The bills that are working their way, and that thing with the blue on the top, is about 2 bills that are bipartisan bills introduced in the Senate and the House. And it's basically, we call it the kids bill, because it is focused on the genealogical and epigenetical damage to children that shows up in grandchildren and children with great-grandchildren. I believe we're going to get it passed. We got into the budget in the Senate, and so I don't think we're going to have that as a point of contention. The interest in Vietnam is we wanted to do research about what was happening with the kids, because their generations are very much closer together than ours. And when that didn't happen, it was sacrificed on the altar of quote-unquote realpolitik. This is we turned our attention to the States. And that research here will then benefit the Vietnamese, because it will, once we can pin it down, epigenetics didn't exist 10 years ago, because it deals with the acids and the production of acids that are the on-off switch of the characteristics on your genes. That's it in a short nutshell. And I'm really here because, as always, John McCullough organized me and said, come here.
Thank you, Rick. Susan Hammond worked with us as deputy director for a number of years, and through some very interesting projects that had to do with the educational sector, in particular with all three countries, and developing the potential of educational exchange, and we'll hear more about that later. But then she moved to Vermont and created the War Legacies project, which, if nothing else comes out of this, you should know about their website for all information that you want to know about Agent Orange and landmines and UXO in one single place. And Susan has continued to be very active with the support of Charles at the Ford Foundation and other sources in trying to address the consequences within Indochina of these legacies.
Thank you. Yeah, and I was born in 1965, so I'm also the child of a Vietnam veteran who served 2 tours. So my first memory of Vietnam is listening to one of these audio tapes. I used to come back from my father, where he would send greetings to his 7 children that were left behind. Well, at that time, no, there were 7 of us. And when he came home, he never really talked about the war. He was one of these, he was career Army, Army Corps of Engineers, and I never heard about the war from him. So in 1991, when I happened to be traveling in the region, that was about the time you could go into Vietnam as a tourist. Still not legally, I don't think, but I did, and, at least not legally for the U.S. side. And that was my first experience in Vietnam. I wanted to see what it was about this country that had taken my father away from me when I was a child. And that was, a turning point in my life. I came back to New York to go to grad school, and I ran into John, and that just, my life went from wanting to be an educator to working in Southeast Asia for the last, I don't know how many years now. But the Agent Orange issue actually has surrounded me my whole life, because I was born in Camp Drum, New York, where it was one of the areas that was first sprayed, tested by the military when they were trying to, they were militarizing chemicals. And then my father, as a veteran, died of Parkinson's just a couple months ago. So. Sorry. But in one of my trips with John, where I first was exposed to the impact of Agent Orange in Vietnam, was when we met with General Tu. His daughter was studying here in the States. She was going to Columbia University, very bright young Vietnamese woman. We went to her house, and we met her sister, who was born after the war, and she was severely disabled. And her family believed that it was due to her father's exposure to Agent Orange in his tour down in the South. And that's really opened my mind to just just thousands and thousands and thousands of other children who, like my family, had been affected by this terrible toxic chemical. And many of you know the facts. 20 million gallons of herbicide sprayed throughout Vietnam and Laos and parts of Cambodia, and 2/3 of that was contaminated with dioxin, which is one of the, it's a known human carcinogen. you know, the science that we're trying to get with this toxic torque bill. I mean, what, 40, 50 years later, we still don't know the full extent of what it does. But the VA has a list of 17 different conditions, including spina bifida in children of veterans, including the Parkinson's that affected my father. And then if you were a female veteran of the war, of which there was only about 8,000 US female veterans, there's a much longer list of birth defects that you could potentially be compensated from by the VA for not Agent Orange, but for service in Vietnam, which just it shows to me that it's not just Agent Orange. I mean, that's one of the issues we're talking about here, but it is the whole toxic environment of war to begin with. And all of that has a huge impact on the environment and on the humans who are exposed to those chemicals. And I have been working for the last almost 20 years with Charles and with Jackie and with others to do what we can to expose these issues, but most importantly, to provide the assistance that we can to the populations who've been affected. And honestly, when it comes to one child in Quang Nam or a child in Saravan, you cannot say 100% that that child's disability is caused by Agent Orange or dioxin. I mean, you could do testing, I suppose, but what's the point, really? I mean, the point is, that's a child, and it's something when I say child, sometimes I'm talking about a 30-year-old child who has no access to medical care, very limited access to medical care, whose family is 24/7, 365, taking care of that child. They cannot go into the fields to work. And it's something that, you know, as Rick said, you know, you go into a place and you leave it better than what you found when you're a Boy Scout. And I think as a U.S. citizen who, you know, and an Army brat surrounded by the military my whole, you know, my younger years, you have a responsibility, and we have a responsibility as citizens, and our government has a responsibility to go in and provide the direct humanitarian assistance that is needed in these countries that we just totally devastated with our weapons and our chemicals. And that's what I do as best I can. Thankfully, I have a great senator in Vermont, Senator Leahy, who has been so supportive, not just on the Agent Orange issue, but the explosive ordnance issue, the banning of landmines. I mean, I can't stop but praise this man. And he has been able to release some funding out of Congress to address this issue. It's been incrementally increasing over the years. Thanks again, a lot of effort by Charles' point, but and the dioxin hotspots that are left in Da Nang Air Base and Bien Hoa Air Base, where these millions of barrels were stored and the dioxin was contaminated in the ground, we are now taking responsibility for that and cleaning up at least Da Nang at this point. It's a slow, very expensive process, but after years and years where the U.S. and Vietnam couldn't even talk about this issue, where Vietnam just said it was all communist propaganda or a way to get war reparations, we're now at the table where the two governments are starting to cooperate together. But not enough yet is getting to the human health side of this issue, and nothing is getting to Laos on this issue, other than the small grant that Jackie and I have from a Swiss foundation. You know, so, well, and another grant from a former IVS, the daughter of a former IVSer. So, but it doesn't take much. I mean, in the work that I do, working with some of these families, I mean, it's, you know, some economic support to provide to this family that can go out into the fields, they can't farm. But they can raise cattle, they can learn a small trade that they can do right out of their house. Or it's providing a scholarship to that child with a disability or not even just providing a scholarship, but advocating with our Vietnamese partners to let the school accept them as the child with a disability. And it's, you know, providing some medical assistance in places. It's a small, you know, $100, $200, $300 goes a huge way in these families. So that is, you know, we don't know the numbers, we don't know the full extent. And sometimes it's too overwhelming, but what you can do is you can work, you can provide assistance to, starting with one family, and then the next, and then the next. And that's what we're doing in Vietnam and now with Jackie in Laos. And just to remind people that, you know, as John mentioned today, that the war doesn't end when the bombs stop. It has huge long-term impacts. I mean, personally for myself, you know, as a child of a veteran, but all of us, every single one of us, just because of the fact that we paid those taxes. We are responsible, and we all have to be a part of the solution.
Thank you. On our most recent trip, two things were striking. One was that our ambassador in Hanoi, Theodosius, said in the meeting with our delegation that he was very pleased to be the first ambassador who could openly talk about Agent Orange as a problem. And it has been 20 years that all of his predecessors knew all of the issues and wanted to, but couldn't go beyond the talking points out of Washington. The other thing was very striking when we went to Alui and visited that is the area on the Vietnamese-Lao border, which was the first main force encounter between American and Vietnamese, North Vietnamese forces, which was dramatized very nicely, and we were soldiers then and young. In Alui, we met, as others have, with it's a minority area with this minority couple who had 2 children living with them still with serious problems. And I think one of the biggest fears that they had was that they were going to not outlive their kids and what was going to happen to them.
It's the hardest question that any of us who work on this issue are asked. What's going to happen to my children when I die? And it's hard because I don't have the answer.
Well, and one, I mean, it was the wonderful, engaging daughter who, her personality had managed to come through, and then there was behind the wall of logs, the son, who you knew was only there as he looked through the wall of logs, and you could see his face and some of his hands, and we asked why, and it was very simple. The effect on him was mental, and the parents were no longer able to pursue him around the village and bring him home. So that was the only way that problem could be dealt with. So, you know, it is not over and not going to be over. So, Chanaba, I mentioned, is nicely reported on by the New York Times, and I hope that's led to some generous responses, but it should have. Laos is the least reported upon aspect of the war in Indochina, but as she will tell you, one of the countries that has a special burden because of it.
I haven't been this emotional.
I think particularly overwhelmed by all of you. Yeah, I worked on this for 10 years, engaging many communities, especially the Lao American communities. I've met many of you, and try to put together the pieces of all that came before, and to hear of your various involvement. You know, when I wasn't even born, right? And from a country that very few people are aware of. And to know that there were people here trying your best to stop what was happening over there is very overwhelming. And you know, I was born in '73, which I later found out was the last year of the bombing that took place over a 9-year period in Laos. And I really didn't know much about the history or even U.S. involvement in Laos when I was younger. And when we came here, we resettled as refugees in the D.C. area. So much of this history is just not told to us by our family because they don't want to talk about it. We're not educated about it in the school system. So we don't know anything about this complex war and all the different layers of it. And so it wasn't until later that I started to just explore, you know, the questions of where did we come here, where am I from in Laos, and what brought our family here. And through those questions, I started to learn more about U.S. involvement in Laos, and that curiosity continued to grow and grow and grow over time. And then I met John Kavanaugh, many of you know from the Institute for Policy Studies, when I was working at the Ford Foundation. Met with John on a separate, completely different topic, and when I introduced myself, the first thing he said was, where is the origin of your name? And I said, oh, I was born in Vietnam, I was born in Laos. And most reaction to that question or answer is, where is that? Is that a city? Is that part of China? Is that part of Thailand? Is that in Vietnam? So, so my homeland wasn't even recognized as a country. But yeah, John's first response was, it's so sad what happened in the Plain of Jars. It's so sad what happened in Xianquan. Do you know Fred Grafman? And I said, I don't know any. He goes, and do you know Jackie, and do you know Roger, and do you know Titus? And just rattled off all these names of people that I've never heard of or knew about. And it turned out John Kavanaugh had been interning with Fred Grafman at the Indochina Resource Center, and of course worked closely on the issue to try to stop the bombings all over Southeast Asia. And when the Indochina Resource Center closed down, John was responsible for cleaning out the office and packing away all the files and books, and he came across the drawings, the very, very special drawings from the Plain of Jars done by survivors that Fred had interviewed that really helped to tell the toll of bombings on civilian populations that he brought over to the U.S. and then compiled into this book, which I'll sort of pass around. And it turns out John Kavanaugh held on to these drawings, the original drawings that Fred had collected from bombing survivors in Xianquan, brought them over to the U.S. They were used as part of a congressional hearing that Senator Kennedy had led about the state of refugees in Southeast Asia. And so John held on to them because for some reason he just thought that they shouldn't be packed up, that they might never see the light of day, that they might be important. So he held on to them for 20-something years. And so when I met him in 2003, it was, he no longer worked in Southeast Asia. But when we met and he heard of my interest and curiosity about this history, he said, why don't you come back? I was living in New York at that time, and I can share more about what I know. And so I came back and spent a couple hours with him, and then he turns around in his cabinet and he pulls out a binder. And it was a binder of the original drawings that Fred had collected from the villagers in Xianquan and Laos. And he said, maybe this will help with some of the education around this history that so many Americans don't know about. And so I took that and assessed the gravity of what that meant. And that started and inspired Legacies of War, which is really starting from the beginning, which is about the history of the bombing, which very few of us are aware of. But to go beyond that, and is to provide space for healing the wounds of war, you know, both the physical and emotional toll of war, and then to bring a sense of hope that maybe the legacy that has been doesn't have to be the legacy that we move forward with. And we do that through sort of our advocacy work. And so we've been around since 2004, you know, with the purpose of raising awareness about the bombing and the remaining UXO. We provide space for healing the wounds of war. And we work closely with the Lao diaspora. You know, about 1 million Southeast Asian refugees came here to the US. Many of them have varying types of relationships with their homeland, but many of them are starting to be engaged and wanting to be engaged. And so we started with the Lao American community to help us to organize, to educate, especially congressional members. And we do a lot of events around the country. And since we've been around, we've been able to help through the help of Senator Leahy and others. Congressman Vega and Honda has been particularly supportive, and also Ben McCollum out of Minnesota, with a large Lao and Hmong population. And we've been able to increase funding from $2 million now to $12 million, which is significant, but nearly not enough. And all the funding then goes to support the groups that are working on the ground. In addition, I think we've been able to provide space as sort of honest brokers between the U.S. government and Lao government, as well as NGOs working on the ground, to really look at how we move forward. And back in 2000, I think this was 2010, no, 2009, we gathered on U.S. soil in Washington, D.C., the first gathering of Lao representatives, U.S. representative, and NGOs that were working on this issue to talk about the state of UXOs. And so we still have a long ways to go. But I wanted to just share, I just came back from Laos 3 weeks ago. And you know, I think, you know, part of the emotion is just the various connection of the work that we're all doing here, the work that we did 40 years ago, and the work that I think continues. And I think, you know, for those of us who have had the privilege to be able to meet and with families and villagers in remote places that are affected by the legacies of war, you know, their voices they're so what's remarkable with every visit is how appreciative the villagers are of our visit. 4 weeks ago, I met with one of the families that had been affected by a UXO explosion, and I'm just going to sort of pass this around. This is Mai Kang, and she's a mother of 4, and her husband one day went out to chop down a tree for firewood, and he struck a bomb bee. A bomb bee had been impregnated into this tree, the root of this tree, and so this is what a bomb bee looks like, right? So I'll just pass that around. And he had struck the tree, and it exploded, and it blinded him, and so disabling him, so he wasn't able to provide for the family, and he became severely depressed. And one day, Marilyn couldn't find him in the house, and she went around looking for him in the yard, and went around the back of the house and found him hanging from a mango tree. He had committed suicide because he felt like he was no longer of use to the family. And so my Peggy is about to raise 4 of her children by herself. And so, you know, John, to your point about how this is just
it's not about the second generation, but it's also about the third generation. It continues. And I've met grandmothers who've held their grandson as his body laid limp, dying. I've met with little boys who witnessed 3 of their friends being blown up and dying. So there are many, many, still many, many remaining left. And and less than 1% of what has been dropped has been cleared. And so we still have a long ways to go. But I think, just in the end, I seriously do not get this emotional, so I apologize. But I just, want to just sort of end on a hopeful note, and that is, we've never gone into a congressional office. We've never had a discussion with somebody who, can make policy to talk about this issue, and no one has ever said no. No one has ever been against this. And so I think it's just a matter of keeping the awareness alive and going. And we know that, Congressman Vega just, ended his term. And so, but we need to expand, I think, knowledge and awareness within the younger congressional membership, because folks like Senator Leahy are in, they're in their sort of elderly age. And so for us, our new sort of strategy is to educate newer congressional members and policymakers, and the newer generation who just have no idea. Their war is Iraq and Afghanistan. That's what they know. So Vietnam is like World War I to them.
Yeah.
No, it's the one right after the Peloponnesian War.
So thank you for the time. I probably went over.
That's okay. The one person I didn't know on this panel was recommended to me. We were originally looking for somebody to talk about the experience of Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodians in the U.S. and then, or more relevantly, their reintegration with their home countries. And also the people from the countries coming to study in the U.S. So we found somebody who was both a case study, that she is a student from Ha Long Bay, Vietnam, who is here doing her PhD, but as it happens, her PhD is about the Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodian, or maybe just the Vietnamese, who worked against the war in the US and in other countries. So we managed to, in a somewhat different way, bring together the pieces, and she's, the thesis, when it's done, will be a real breakthrough in understanding, and so we're very glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. I thought I was supposed to bring some happy note to this meeting, but it's really hard. I will try my best. I came here in 2007 and on a scholarship, a Fulbright scholarship. So just, and I was born and raised in Vietnam. First, I would like to talk about the Vietnamese community here before 1975 and then from 1975 onward. Before 1975, there were a few hundred Vietnamese in this country, as it's all, and very scattered, very dispersed. They were, but at the same time, they were united in the belief that Vietnam was one country, and they worked, one way or the other to try to end the war. So that was very brief about them. One example of these people involved a group called the Leadership Scholarship Program students. They were brought here by USAID in starting in 1968, 67, 68. They were the best and the brightest in South Vietnam. They were supposed to be trained in the US institutions and then go back to serve the Saigon government. So that the Saigon government, when the country was freed from communism, would have better policy or policy in favor of the U.S. And instead, many of those students turned into anti-war activists, very visible and vocal anti-war activists. And so USAID at some point even had to testify in front of Congress. And those students even risked losing their scholarships and legal prosecution in this country and even imprisonment in South Vietnam because the Saigon government officially sentenced them in their absence. So that's about them. And then in around 1975, April 1975, there's the first wave of Vietnamese refugees coming to this country, and then it lasted, for years after that. The Vietnamese who came after 1975 were completely different, and they implemented quite a few, some extreme Vietnamese in this group implemented quite a few terrorist measures to try to silence and take revenge on the Vietnamese who were anti-war before them, or even expressed any anti-war sentiments at all. For example, I have many cases, but we should know about this first case which involved Lâm Dương. He, on July 21st, 1981, the 27-year-old was shot dead outside his apartment in broad daylight. Local police have never convicted anyone in the killing, and so the motive remains unknown. But within days of Lâm murder, news spread that a shadowy anti-communist group had claimed responsibility, sending a chilling message to Vietnamese refugees everywhere that they should stay in line with their political views or risk death. Between 1982 and 1990, 5 more Vietnamese Americans, 4 of them journalists, were violently killed. Vietnamese journalists are the largest group of immigrants and reporters murdered on U.S. soil, claiming 5 lives out of the 10 immigrant journalists that have been killed in the U.S. since 1981. Fast forward to nowadays, according to the 2012 census, there were about over 1,600,000 people who identify themselves as Vietnamese alone, or over 1,800,000 in combination with other ethnicities, representing the 4th largest foreign-born population from Asia, after India, the Philippines, and China. And this population is growing and returning to Vietnam in greater and greater number, and contributing to Vietnam economically as well. For example, in 2012, despite the economic downturn, the Vietnamese overseas sent $11 billion to Vietnam in investment, and the majority of which came from the United States. Just to give you an idea, the number of the money that the Vietnamese here sent to Vietnam in 2012, for example, accounted for 5% of the GDP and 20% of the state budget. So that's a really, really large number. Culturally, many Vietnamese Americans are returning to Vietnam to participate in joint projects in film and art, helping not only to develop the art industry in Vietnam, but also to promote the image of the country in the U.S. And for many Vietnamese, Vietnam serves almost as a cultural haven, where they can find refuge because they feel marginalized in this country. So the Vietnamese government recognizes the importance of the Vietnamese diaspora in this country. So together with this renovation policy in 1986, it has been shifting its position toward this community. In 1994, when the U.S. lifted its embargo on trade with Vietnam, the Vietnamese government allowed certain overseas Vietnamese to return and settle permanently in the country. And 2 years later, in 1996, the government allowed all overseas Vietnamese to obtain a Vietnamese passport. And in 1999, it decided officially that those who possessed the passports would have the same rights as any other Vietnamese who lived inside the country. In 2004, the government issued the Directive Number 36, which is the most cited, stating that the Vietnamese overseas community were an integral part of the Vietnamese nation. And at the same time, increasingly more Vietnamese are studying in the United States. In 2014 alone, there are 20,000 Vietnamese students enrolled at U.S. institutions from high school to college levels. The U.S. government also implements various programs to bring Vietnamese to study in the U.S. Until 2014, it has brought to the U.S. soil over 4,000 students and scholars. The Vietnamese who return to Vietnam from these programs continue to serve in high positions in the government and other sectors in the economy. Apparently, what USAID had failed with the South Vietnamese students has now been corrected with the communist government. To highlight the important role by the overseas Vietnamese to Vietnam's developments nowadays, I would like to tell you a story about a person named Thắng Trần, arriving in the U.S. with his parents in 1991 as part of the Orderly Departure Program. His love for the home country never faded. Since 1995, when he was still a student at UConn, he regularly hosted talks about Vietnamese culture and heritage, featuring Vietnamese experts from all over the world. Together with friends in 1996, he started a Vietnamese magazine to promote awareness of Vietnam's culture called Rhythm of Life, which reaches out to Vietnamese Americans of all political positions. In 2000, he was being backed by several high-profile overseas Vietnamese scholars. He founded the Institute for Vietnamese Culture and Education, called IVCE, which has presented 44 events across the U.S., introducing audiences to Vietnamese classical music, painting, literature, and films. He also travels to Vietnam to offer workshops on how to participate in students' exchanges in the U.S. and assistance with exchange program applications. Over time, those who once opposed his work as propaganda for the communist government have changed their minds. They love me now, that's what he said. Recently, his passion for Vietnam, combined with a passion for old maps, has put him in the center of the row between Vietnam and China over the sovereignty of the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. So far, he has sent about 135 old maps to the Vietnamese government. These maps could be used in the International Court of Justice as evidence to show that these islands historically belonged to Vietnam. The Vietnamese government has also publicly honored his contribution, and he is only one of many Vietnamese Americans who are returning to Vietnam nowadays. In conclusion, the role of the Vietnamese Americans are playing in fostering Vietnam's economy and security cannot be underestimated, especially now with the intensified tension in the region and the fast rapprochements between the U.S. and Vietnam. Apart from the official modification on the Vietnamese government's part, the media and the popular discourse have also been encouraged to modify the tone. So ones who used to work for or affiliated with the Saigon governments are now no longer called Legacies or Nguy in Vietnamese. The Bien Hoa cemetery where those dead Nguy are buried used to be closed and rather deserted, and now it is open to the public. The Saigon troops who died defending the Paracel Islands against Chinese attack in 1974 are now honored in the media as war martyrs. It is not easy to overcome a history of war of over 20 years of millions of deaths and immeasurable psychological and environmental cost. But there are signs that reconciliation is possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
That last story of the honoring of the Paracels veterans, I hadn't heard, and that's very important. So the last of our speakers is the longest experienced of any of us.
And oldest.
Andre Savaggio, think back to John Paul Vann. Think back to the first American advisory teams. Andre was part of that. Think back to when there were negotiations taking place in very delicate ways between the two countries, utilizing the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Bangkok as one of the link points. Andre Savaggio was the interpreter, and I'm sure more than just the interpreter of words, who was involved in those negotiations. Think back to when the embargo ends and American business begins to enter Vietnam. The representative of General Electric in Hanoi.
10 years.
10 years. And in between that, he's worked for the State Department and worked on the refugee stuff and many things that probably I have no idea about, but throughout this, are unlikely, though we came from different places, it has been a very affirming relationship. I'm very glad to have been able to include you in this session.
And I'm very glad that John included me in this session. I had to apologize to my boss in Michigan for the Interstate Traveler Company for taking some time out of pocket, but he sympathized that I should share my Vietnam experience with people like yourself and like John. And John, I thank you also for assigning me an appropriate topic to my experience. You know, the relationship between security and business interests. Well, got a foot in both camps, you know. 9 years of fighting the war that we lost and that I knew we would lose before I refused another extension for a 10th year. And also, as John said, 10 years of representing General Electric, and then a couple of years as a consultant for Oracle, helping them win a big international bidding contract with the Ministry of Finance for software. Never mind, I don't know much about software, but you know, I didn't go to the Ministry of Finance with my Oracle card. I went to the Foreign Ministry and talked about, well, should it come to pass that the Oracle proposal would be deemed best, then here is how I will use that with the House Ways and Means Subcommittee in Washington, D.C. about the bilateral relationship and all that. So, you know, just there really is a relationship and a strong relationship. And I realized that early on, before I ever became a businessman, leaving the Army to go into business and then political appointments and stuff. So, and what I realized soon is that the Vietnamese understand that and have always understood it. If they're nothing else, they're smart. And you know, when I represented General Electric, I mean, I just, you know, hired 100% Vietnamese. And that was before the United States lifted the trade embargo. But, you know, President Bush, the older one, in April '92, let Americans for the first time establish rep offices, April 1992. And I was in Bangkok on the assignment that John mentioned, a political appointment from Bush 41 to work for the U.S. ambassador in Bangkok to help, you know, to do the political analysis of Vietnam from a Bangkok base. And then later on, when that expired, they asked me to go to the refugee camps in Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and encourage voluntary repatriation back to Vietnam from these camps among those Vietnamese who had been what they called double screened out. They were not going to be resettled any place because the host government and the United Nations Commissioner for High Refugees determined, based on their background and all, that they did not meet the political requirement of the UN Convention on Refugees of a well-founded fear of persecution on return to Vietnam based on religion, ethnicity, political opinion, anything. And the problem that they had was because the Vietnamese, the party and the government had a clear policy. not only do not persecute people returning voluntarily, but help them to find jobs and things like that. So the Foreign Ministry of Vietnam said they wanted me to take that job, and that would help them integrate with ASEAN. And I said, well, sure, if that's what you want me to do. So I said, I will do that. But I said, but you give me some help. Every time I go one round of these camps, I'm going to be tired. And so give me a visa to come into Vietnam. And then I go and visit people who have already returned at my initiative anytime, any place I want to. And they let me do it. And then that way you could stimulate real email, not email, but postal mail, between people who had already returned, and therefore attenuating or vitiating the reactionary propaganda, slandering the Vietnamese, the Xuyen Thanh, So anyway, so I just did that. And then that's when I got the General Electric offer. And then again, I asked the Vietnamese in the Foreign Ministry, should I take it? Yes. Do. And then orchestrated this, as I told Foreign Minister Tyke when I was interpreting for him for Richard Armitage. And then later on, of course, I was interpreter, as John said, for John Kerry and for General Vesey. And what I did is just say, okay, I told the Foreign Minister, sự thật là vũ khí sắc bén của Đảng, Nhà nước và nhân dân Việt Nam. It means that truth is the most powerful weapon for the party, the government, and the people of Vietnam. And I will do everything I can until I die to get out the truth for the mutual benefit of both countries. So I did. I took the job and as I say, hired all Vietnamese. And then that helped build the knowledge of the security and business relationships. Because, of course, we started getting, remember, we had permission to set up, but no permission to market products, except medical equipment, which is one of General Electric's. But anyway, so we had congressional delegations come out. And of course, then the message to GE, from GE to me was, okay, do your thing, talk to reality to these congressional delegates and try to get political momentum in Washington to lift the embargo. Subtext, don't get caught doing it by the press. Because after all, even reactionaries buy refrigerators in the United States. They don't want to compromise. So that was the kind of thing. So I get these, and it was really, I really enjoyed it because I'd get invited to a Codel and talk about,
What's a Codel?
General,
Congressional delegation.
Yeah,